Hello, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan. It's an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group. That's a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Let's get right to it. I am just so happy to be joined today by Thomas Chatterton Williams. Thomas Chatterton Williams is a staff writer at The Atlantic and the author of Losing My Cool, Self-Portrait in Black and White, and the forthcoming Summer of Our Discontent. He is a visiting professor of humanities at Bard College, a 2022 Guggenheim Fellow, and a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. His work has been widely recognized and highly regarded for a number of years. I'm just so glad he's taken the time to join us today. Thomas, thank you so much. I mentioned before we hit record, this is I'm sure it's a whirlwind tour for you with the new book dropping. How are you holding up with all of it so far?
So far, so good. And it's such a pleasure to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I was just looking at just the folks who gave affirmations for your book. Yuval Levin, Jonathan Haidt, Henry Lewis. Like, if they haven't already been on this program, I aspire to have them on my program. So it speaks so highly of you and your work and the folks that you're associating with. So I'm really grateful that you're taking the time.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I figured I'd start this way. In the prologue, you share a bit about your own background and heritage, the point of which, as you put it, is the story of American racism is not merely an abstraction for me. So for context, I was hoping you'd share a bit about your family's history.
Sure. Well, I'm the son of a Black man from the segregated South. My dad is a generation older than my friends' dads were, so he's really old enough to be my grandfather, born in 1937, and grew up under segregation, and realized very early on in his Texas childhood that the only way he was going to have a chance at life was if he somehow got himself an education. That was going to be what would allow him to transcend the circumstances of second-class citizenship that he was thrust into. And he did that. He was the first person in his family to go to college and to go to graduate school. And he really made his life one of constant learning and self-improvement. And that was really fundamental. That is fundamental to his character. He's 88 years old this summer on Saturday. And my mother is, she's a white woman from Southern California. She's a boomer. She grew up in kind of a milieu in which she didn't think of herself in terms of her European ethnicity. She was just American, and she didn't think very much of it, but she's a devout Christian. And one of the aspects of her faith that she took very seriously and still does to this day is that, racial differences are not meaningful. They're superficial. And so she fell in love with my father, and that cost her in some ways in the society she was living in at the time. Many people were not so enlightened. They got married in 1970, so that's 3 years after Loving v. Virginia made it legal across the country to interracially wed. They were not necessarily welcome in every environment that my mother came from, and so she chose to make her family with my father, and they moved east from California where they were. And I was born in 1981, grew up in New Jersey.
Where in Jersey?
Excuse me. Scotch Plains, Fanwood, New Jersey. It's suburbs about 45, 50 minutes west of Penn Station in Manhattan.
Oh, okay. I was a little to the south of that. I'm sorry. I grew up in the Freehold area. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So about the same distance from the city, but just a different direction.
When were you there?
So I'm 10 years older than you. I was born in 71. Mm-hmm. Graduated high school in 89. So it was like 5 different high schools by then, but it's basically the same high school that Bruce Springsteen went to.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, my generation was more Blues Traveler. Actually, Bon Jovi was a little bit before me, but Blues Traveler, those guys were playing keggers and, backyard parties when I was going to high school. So
I was just down in Belmar last weekend which was really lovely. Went on the boardwalk.
Oh man, so that yeah, it's great this time of year, man. It doesn't. There's some aspects of it just don't seem to change.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's
That's
fine. Jersey's great. It's such a small state, but there's so many little micro areas that not you don't know all the different parts of Jersey if you're from Jersey.
well, I would imagine if you're going due west from the city, is that like Route 78 or Route 80?
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Because you
78.
get to some beautiful mountainous areas. The Delaware Water Gap is not too far from there, right?
Yeah, if you go farther out, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I'm curious now about your parents. Your mom was, as you described, a devout Christian. Were you raised in
Hmm.
the church?
No, my father's an atheist. My mother's a devout evangelical Christian.
Okay.
Her father was a Baptist minister, but they raised us to make up our own minds about faith. But they enrolled us. Neither of them is Catholic, but we were always in Catholic schools our whole
Okay.
lives. So I was exposed to Catholic teaching from kindergarten through undergrad. I went to Georgetown, but I'm not myself faithful. So I was
Well,
exposed to it, liked what I learned, and then read Dostoevsky and went in a different direction.
oh, that's awesome. Wow. Yeah, we could go a whole different direction. This might become a different podcast than I planned, but so now I'm curious the kinds of conversations that your parents were having with your dad as an atheist and your
Hmm.
mom a devout Christian. You make a mention of, I forget where it was, maybe it was in the acknowledgments about your brother Clarence that taught you how to have rigorous debates and
Hmm.
helped you develop a thick skin. Is that when you started really having these more in-depth conversations and from different points of view?
Well, I just grew up in one of those households where my mother is not argumentative, but my father certainly is, and you have to establish your points and defend them. And my brother is just going to disagree with anything that I say. So it was just one of those dinner tables where you could say it's like sunny outside, and my dad would be like, "Well, what exactly do you mean by sunny?" And my brother would be like, "It's cloudy." And so you just had to learn to fend for yourself on any position. But I think that was actually really beneficial if you're going to be not just a writer, but like somebody who deals in argument and polemic. I think it's good to develop a thick skin because that comes with the territory.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up because I'm sure I had read some of your pieces in was it New Yorker and Harper's prior to your time now with the Atlantic, but then you really came on the scene uh, or came of really heightened awareness for me with a letter on justice and open debate. Were you one of the primary? I know you were a signatory, but were you one of the primary writers of that letter?
Yeah, there were five of us, and I was very honored to be involved in that group. There was George Packer, David Greenberg, Robert Worth, Mark Lilla, and myself. We drafted the letter and we organized it. We emailed people for a couple of weeks around the clock, just asking to get people to sign the letter, and then we were all really kind of amazed at the list that we put together and
Yeah.
at the kind of response that happened after the letter was published. And I was at
Again,
Harper's at the time, so like Rick MacArthur and Chris Bea at Harper's they were amazing, and they saw the worth of the letter and they published it immediately.
yeah, again, I mean, some of my favorite thinkers, Anne Applebaum,
Hmm.
David Brooks, I think, is on here.
Hmm.
I mean, you just Jonathan Rauch. Uh, I don't know if he's listening, but
I,
sometimes he does
I
listen to
love
these.
John Ratch. Oh, he's
John is
great.
the best, isn't he? Um,
Yeah,
but just it's a list of people that I either am devouring their work and their thinking, and just aspire to, understand them better, have them on my show. Now,
yeah.
give us for folks that aren't familiar off the top of their head, give us a little bit of context. I, I could read the thing, but if you would summarize it for us, and then I'm also curious about what kind of backlash you got.
Well, it was just a straightforward statement in the summer of 2020. I don't know if anybody listening remembers, but that was a kind of exceptional moment when people were getting censored formally and informally for their viewpoints, for political disagreements within academic, media, cultural institutions, and political institutions. People were losing jobs. These terms are always a little bit inflammatory, but cancel culture, for want of a better term, was really a real thing. And, there were instances at the New York Times and other places where people were just losing their jobs and mobs were targeting people's employment on social media. And we thought there's a need for a kind of organized statement that says that you can't really have social justice without tolerance for viewpoint diversity, that justice and freedom of expression are inextricably linked, and that actually minorities and people with less power always fare better in societies that are maximally tolerant, and that when viewpoints and freedom of speech are repressed, that always harms actually the least powerful in a society. It was a very anodyne statement, just saying we should extend people grace, not look to stigmatize and punish ideas and opinions that we disagree with, and counter bad ideas with better ideas, as opposed to with censorship. Got a lot of support, and then it was released into the world, and the backlash is still going on. I mean, we still kind of can't believe the kind of responses that it garnered. But we got a lot of support, but it also, people told us that we were transphobic, that we were racist, that it was a Zionist document. I mean, all the document says is that, like, we should have a marketplace of ideas where people are allowed to respectfully disagree. And obviously there are some agreed upon boundaries of debate that nobody is arguing in good faith should be brought back into play. And no one's saying that you should deny the Holocaust, or that people should say that Black people aren't fully human. That wasn't the point of the letter. The point of the letter was that, we basically agree on what the norms of decency are, but there are many ideas and areas of debate that are not yet agreed upon. And so we should extend some grace to people if they misgender somebody, or if they, are debating about, aspects of racial equity and equality that are not yet firmly established. Like, ideas of racism were changing so fast that people were being called racist for things that 2 years ago wouldn't have struck anybody as out of bounds. And so we have to slow down and realize that people can actually hash these things out without being punished and made a scapegoat or made an example of, so that other people will be fearful and will limit the amount of ideas that they feel free to express.
Now, you go into some depth in Summer of Our Discontent, the incident that happened at the Poetry Foundation. Was that one of the did that happen before you released the letter?
Or it did. Yeah, I believe
okay,
it
so
did.
maybe was that one of the inspirations, if you will, for
Yeah, I mean, that was very much on all of our minds. I mean, that didn't get the kind of national attention that I think it should have, but that was an astonishing example of a kind of fast-moving, aggressively punitive culture of not just censorship, but also institutional capture. For anybody who's not familiar with it, and many people probably wouldn't be, because it's not the New York Times, but the Poetry Foundation is an extraordinarily well-funded nonprofit. They have they had at the time, it's probably bigger now. They had a $257 million endowment from the Eli Lilly Foundation, or pharmaceutical fortune. And they published Poetry magazine. And at the time of George Floyd's death, the magazine put out a statement saying that they were appalled by the death and that they supported, the movement for Black lives, essentially. And this kind of 4-sentence statement that was fully supportive was deemed by a kind of cadre of activists and poets and other supporters of the activism to be not just not ideal, but actually worse than a slap in the face. And they demanded that the chairman of the board and the editor-in-chief of the magazine step down, and that they demanded that the endowment be put in their control. And it was kind of like, in the book, I liken it to a mixture of barbarians at the gate and Mau Mauing the flat catchers. It was like a hostile takeover
Yeah.
with a real kind of Mau Mauing racial angle, and it was unbelievable. And of course, the institution immediately capitulated, because in that heightened moment, people didn't even defend themselves when they were in the right. So it was just one of these instances where we were just saying to ourselves, this can't be real. This is crazy. Like, we have to slow down. And why are institutions capitulating? They're being shaken down. It's like a kind of, like, nice foundation you have going there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. People were being told what they can do with their own finances and their own resources. In many ways, it worked as a kind of power grab, because one of the things that I can't speak to anybody else who signed the letter, but one of the things that I've always been troubled by is that, this is not about justice for a poor man who was killed in a horrific way in the streets of Minneapolis. That has nothing to do with the circumstances of George Floyd. That is a kind of jobs program, or a kind of capture of wealth for people that are already elite, highly educated, in a position that would never allow them to be broken in the way that George Floyd was broken. So it really is using this instance of outrage as something that happened to a vulnerable man to take things for oneself when one is already in a much more privileged situation. And that rubbed me the wrong way. Still
Yeah.
does.
Yeah. Well, you put it really well. I don't know how when you recorded this, but your conversation with Yasha Monk, the way you put it, I'm quoting you accurately, is class is raced and race is classed. So there's a distinction there between that concept and what the disorientation of what many of us were experiencing after the murder of George Floyd, and that summer, the summer that you write about so well in such depth in this book. I remember it quite well. I had certain experiences where I was on certain calls, industry calls,
Mm-hmm.
where it felt to me, it's hard to describe, but the best way I could describe it is it's as if there was this other language that I wasn't privy to, that many of my friends and colleagues spoke fluently, like out of the womb. And I just had no idea. I didn't even understand the language, let alone know how to speak it. And that was that made me guilty by default, right? So if I was even invited into the rooms or welcomed into the rooms, it was only with the assumption that I'd take a flagellum to myself the entire time, merely
Yeah.
because of the
Yeah.
shade of my skin. And it left, to your point, it left a lot of the other aspects of who we are as human beings. The fact is, I'm Jewish. So I couldn't get the words of Anne Frank's father out of my mouth in so many of those meetings. And loosely translated, it's I was white enough to fight for the Kaiser in World War II, but I wasn't white enough to save my family from being eviscerated in World War II. Excuse me, World War I, he fought for the Kaiser. World
Mm-hmm.
War II, his family was
Mm-hmm.
eviscerated tragically, just like my family. You could probably discern that I'm still disoriented by the whole experience, and still trying to repair relationships. I'm wondering, in relation to that, it sounds like you started planning this book not too long after that, within months, if not the next year. But the you also talk about one of your advocates, Errol McDonald at Knopf, who fought, as you put it, fought for it at a fraught cultural moment. What were some of those headwinds that you were facing at the time that you were? I would imagine that this wasn't the people that you were presenting this idea to weren't, throwing themselves out of each other's way to try to publish it first. How much of a headwind were you facing?
Yeah. Well, first, I just want to say, that's a really good way of explaining the dynamic that we were all living through. It's like other people were native speakers, and you're just trying to express ideas in a language that's foreign to you. And then it's like you're in France, where my children are, and where I live part of the time. It's like where they're really like strictly judging you, and treating you really badly if you mispronounce a word, or if you don't speak like a native.
Yeah.
But suddenly you're just thrust in this foreign language environment, and you're just being thrown out there, and you're supposed to be able to know all the ways and habits and customs, but these things are brand new. and you've had no experience with them. That it was so disorienting that way. That's such a good metaphor for the whole thing. It was like you were being asked to speak something else, and but it was with a real a real cost attached if you mispronounced anything or if your accent wasn't right. It was a very, very difficult time to navigate for people, and I'm talking about people of good faith and goodwill, not people who are the actual racists or xenophobes or transphobes, but people who actually intend to be right, but were getting punished for simply mispronouncing words, as you put it. That's a helpful example to use. As for Errol McDonald, I mean, he's my editor at Knopf, kind of wonderful elder statesman of the publishing industry, protege of Toni Morrison's. And then also, he was her editor. I mean, the man's kind of a legendary publishing figure. And, he's not white. He's a man of African descent who has made it in the publishing industry and has worked in the industry for many years. And I think, I couldn't speak for him, but I think, my book came across his desk at a moment where he thought some of what was going on was absurd and deserved an exploration. And what happened was that, I started thinking about the book, in earnest in 2021, because things were still, I say that like the summer of 2020 basically lasted until 2023 or something like that. It was a long moment. And by 2021, I was thinking of writing a book. And, a lot of people would read the proposal and be really excited by it. And then they would get told when they tried to buy it that they couldn't, or that they couldn't come at the offer level that they wanted to. And it kind of took somebody like Errol, who was just like, you can't tell me that I'm racist, and you can't tell me that I don't understand what it means to be Black. Like, this is a good book and I want to have this book. And so he kind of had the moral authority, or he had the kind of identity that was beyond reproach. And so he was able to buy the book in a way that was really, I think, it was fair, and it was also kind of courageous for him, though, because, he had to put his own credibility on the line to have it at that moment. It was something that a lot of people, in the publishing industry, not at any one house in particular, but the general mood was such that that even if some of the points in here are right, is this really the right moment to say that? And I think he came down on the side that that's what we're in the business of doing, is publishing books that, like, it's not about the moment when you can say something. It's about, is this a compelling argument? Is this correct? Is this, is this true?
Yeah.
And we're in the business of doing that. And, internally, I know there is, quite, for that moment, there was a quite influential young figure within the publishing house who vehemently opposed it and tried to make it so that he couldn't buy it. So he was really quite courageous, and I owe a lot to him for that.
I was reading the part in your book where you introduced the concept of moral clarity when someone sent me an interview that just took place. I think it must have been last week. It's a YouTube show. It got a lot of views, apparently, a lot of subscribers. Two YouTubers were interviewing Senator Slotkin from Michigan. And that moral clarity was running around in my brain because I had just read that part in Summer of Discontent in your book. Could you? But then I realized by the end of this interview, I couldn't even make it to the very end. I made it about 2/3 or maybe 3/4 of the way through, because what the interviewers were doing, it didn't strike me as an interview. It didn't strike me as a conversation or even an inquiry. It struck me as an interrogation. So that's why moral clarity, but really what I came away with was a moral chauvinism in that instance. I don't know if you've been privy to that particular interview, but if you could you describe what that concept? I would imagine that you were battered at the time that you were proposing the book by this concept of moral clarity.
Well, moral clarity is this phrase and this idea that really gained traction in that summer of 2020. And it was really popularized by this journalist, Wesley Lowery, who had been at the Washington Post, and he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. that made the case after James Bennett was fired at the New York Times op-ed page
Right.
for having published an op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton about using the National Guard or the military to stop not the peaceful protests, but the rioting and looting that was happening across the country. That op-ed was considered by a segment of the left to be beyond the pale and to put people's lives in danger, and not just people in the streets, but it was presumed to put Black and other people of colors lives who worked for the New York Times, who were reporters and going out into the streets to write about the rioting. It was supposed to have put their lives in danger. James Bennett was fired. The op-ed pages subsequently published a couple of weeks later a piece by Wesley Lowery on why the age of journalistic neutrality and the experiment of objectivity had failed, and we needed to embrace moral clarity, which sounds nice in principle, like some things are right, some things are wrong. Why not just why be objective about anything? Why not just always advance an agenda that adheres to a clarified morality that everybody can agree on? The only problem with that is that no one agrees on morality. It's an age-old problem. I believe that ISIS had a view of moral clarity. I really do think that. I think Vladimir Putin, in his way, thinks he has moral clarity. I know that people that I completely disagree with, who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, a lot of them believe they were operating from a position of pristine moral clarity. So this is such a naive and jejune kind of view that was expressed that we could all know what's the morally clear view, and then we could just publish along those lines. The reason why, that would be everybody's choice if we actually agreed on what's morally right and wrong. The fact that we don't necessitates us stepping back and actually just trying to present evidence to the best of our ability to describe the world as well as possible, and to trust our readers to be informed by our reportage and our arguments enough to arrive at conclusions on their own without us leading them and kind of trumping the conclusion for them and telling them what is moral and what is not. It's not the job of journalism to be educating in that way. It's the job of journalism to be informing. And so this was a huge disagreement within the industry. And for a moment, that viewpoint was carrying the day. I think no one can make that case now, because I think that we're such a fractured society right now that clearly you have an ascendant reactionary right wing that has captured all of the institutions of power. And there's nothing that makes you want to get rid of this argument in favor of moral clarity more than your enemies having control of all the institutions that matter and imposing their view of moral clarity on you at every turn in ways that you don't agree with, and in ways that seem morally incorrect to you. That's why neutrality, the kind of old-fashioned, boring liberalism that allows everybody's point of view to be heard and then allows intelligent citizens to decide, is the only way that actually works, especially in a dynamic, multi-ethnic society like ours, where we can never reach a consensus viewpoint on what is and is not right.
Do you have any faith that that's possible in this climate?
That's a good question. Good old-fashioned liberalism is certainly being challenged, but I think it's the only thing we've got. Imposing a moral viewpoint, especially in journalism, we can see that has backfired. We can see that actually promotes a kind of backlash, and it gives kind of credence to a viewpoint. It gives evidence to a viewpoint that says that everything is biased, and that therefore, we have to reject expertise. We have to reject, institutional authority, because in fact, it was always a lie, this idea that things were neutral and objective. I think it empowers the enemies of tolerance and openness in a way that we can't live with. I don't know if it's possible to put the toothpaste back in the container, but we have to try to re-achieve the liberal society. That's all we got. That's what works. What we have now isn't working.
Right. A lot of folks,
I'm sorry.
that's all right. A lot of folks talk about sort of a horseshoe effect, where
Hmm.
folks who might have identified on the far left, as well as folks who might identify on the far right, which, by the way, I don't think that continuum is sufficient for our political climate. But regardless, they end up in the middle with a shared illiberalism. The cancel culture has certainly been exhibited with extremism from folks who supported Trump in their attack on all kinds of institutions, from journalism to law firms to just all across the board. That's why that something interesting about your critique, and I hold it up with as robust of a critique as Yasha Monk's book from a couple of years ago, The Identity Trap. I think it's a
Great
much
book.
Oh yeah, it's helped me clarify on he really was able to diagnose a lot of the ailments, a lot of the ailment of what we're going through, but specifically because he engaged seriously with Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo and the 1619 Project, where he did what E.J. Dionne talks about, where
Hmm.
you present the best version of their argument and then you engage with it, which I think
Hmm.
he did really successfully in all of his work, but certainly in that book. Um, a lot of folks, if they hear you in certain interviews and read certain columns that you're writing now, might think that you're Trump adjacent, you're MAGA
Oh my
adjacent.
God. No, no, no.
Have you been getting
Not
Have
in,
you been getting any of that?
well, it's very strange because no Trump people think that.
Oh yeah.
But, it's very strange to be, Yash is in this position too. He's a good friend. Anybody in the center has this very strange feeling of Trump people call you woke, and woke people call you MAGA adjacent or MAGA apologist. And you just wish that they could, you just wish that they could see how the other side sees you, and that would maybe make them, they might not agree with the position that you're arguing, but that would maybe make them a little bit more charitable in where they presume you to be coming from. Like I wish that Trump people could see what woke people think of me, and I wish vice versa. But no, I think there's a kind of sector of the left that thinks that anybody that's even in the center is essentially running interference for making possible Trump. And so that's just the same thing as actually going out and full throatedly supporting him. Um, we have this kind of zero sum politics where nuance is frowned upon as somehow not you're supposed to be ideologically coherent at all times. And what that means is that you're supposed to actually be an adherent. And anybody who says that, well, actually, reality is a little bit more complicated than that is insufficiently loyal to the cause and is therefore benefiting the opponent. There's no sense that, we can have a kind of a nuanced middle ground that seeks to have, some form of moderation. And that's not to say that everything is equivalent. I don't think actually that what the threat Donald Trump and his movement pose to American society, I believe, is absolutely worse than what preceded it, the kind of creeping authoritarianism and censoriousness by the ascendant social justice movement that had captured so many of the institutions that matter in society. I think what Trump is doing is worse. I think when the state is censoring, when the state is intimidating, when the state is applying a kind of lawlessness to the way our society operates, that's obviously much more dangerous than when, cohorts of people are doing this within private institutions. With that said, I don't think that that means that therefore you can never criticize what people are doing in private institutions because there's something out there that's actually worse. And I also would go so far as to say I don't think you can fully understand why so many Americans, including increasing numbers of Black and Latino and other non-white parts of the population, looked at both options and said, I actually prefer Donald Trump and his movement, however authoritarian or however lawless it is, to what's been offered to me from these kind of, this Democratic Party that's captured by leftist activists who who have been exercising their authority over me and canceling me and censoring me for the past decade and a half. I've seen what they are, and I prefer this. I think that any honest kind of effort to challenge what Trump and his movement are doing would have to be able to be self-reflective and self-critical, and that's what really I don't see happening on the left these days. It's easy to criticize Trump. It's easy to say, well, he's worse. Yes, and how did so much of the country decide that he was still, all things considered, more attractive than us? That for me, that demands self-critique, and I've been amazed that more people aren't willing to do it.
I think in terms of that self-critique, I will say this, that I've had conversations with friends and family members, neighbors that have been supportive of Trump, whether they voted for him once, twice, three times. Um, and I couldn't, whenever the subject of January 6th comes up, it's almost like this gag reflex, but it's a
Mm-hmm.
rhetorical reflex when they, well, what about the riots, they call them, at the
Mm-hmm.
summer of 2020, or, they just kind of shorthand refer to Portland as if that's like an intellectual coat hanger that, well, we all agree that, no, 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 we don't agree. And I could never quite grant the equivalency there, but
Right.
you made a much more cogent um, argument for, if we're looking at the prism of what was happening in totality throughout the summer of 2020, we can understand how folks got to January 6th. Could you expound on that a little bit, because it's the best, it's the clearest argument that I've heard to connect those two with a little bit less intellectual laziness, if you will.
Well, I don't think that anything that happened before January 6th caused it, but I do think that under a condition of, we have to step back and say what else was going on at this time. A pandemic was going on. People were being made crazy by all of the kind of pressures that were both political, but that were also just, this worldwide pandemic. People are scared. People are out of work. People are looking to revolt against something. And for the months preceding January 6th, the television screens were showing cities burning. People were seeing in their own communities that people were rioting and looting and sometimes killing people with a kind of impunity. Not only was it often dismissed as not happening, the evidence of your senses, you were told, was untrustworthy, but also sometimes when it was admitted that it was happening, it was even kind of being, if not celebrated, excused, and being, you were being told that this was kind of simply this is what it sounds like when the unheard make themselves heard, or like rioting is the language of the unheard, we kept being told. And I think for a lot of people that created a kind of permission structure, or it was kind of, once that kind of, once you start permitting politics to be made with violence in the street, you are no longer able to limit where that goes, who interprets that, who takes a kind of validation for their own desire to make politics in the street from that precedent. And so I think that the summer of 2020 and the kind of amazing violence that sometimes we saw, like, let's be real. People were looking at stores being looted, at buildings burning, at people sometimes being assaulted and beat for sport in the street. You were having, breathless interviews on NPR with authors of books with titles like "In Defense of Looting." People were seeing that for months. People were
Right.
seeing Portland had 100 days in a row of clashes with the police. I went to Portland a couple of years after 2020. I went in 2023. The Justice Center downtown was still boarded up like in a foreign territory.
Yeah.
People saw these things happen, and I think that influenced their idea of how they might go about rejecting whatever kind of decisions that they don't agree with, or making their voices more heard when they didn't like the way that politics was being conducted by other means. So I think those things have to be thought about, not in a vacuum, not each in a vacuum, but in conversation with each other. And of course, January 6th went well beyond anything that happened in Kenosha or Seattle or Portland, but it didn't happen in zero context
Right.
either.
Right. Yeah. And as you point out, one of your chapters is titled "Fiery but Mostly Peaceful Protests." So there were enablers from all different directions, whether it was folks that were denying altogether, explaining it away, or recontextualizing it to
Yeah.
suit an a priori argument. And we're seeing the effects, similar effects of this to this day. Within the last week or so, I continue to see people cheering on the murder of Wesley LePatner, the chief executive of Blackstone, as part of the mass shooting in New York, which is directly in line with the Free Luigi movement.
Yeah.
As you put it, it was you just there's so much I took from this book, by the way. But
Thank you.
one of the quotes that I took, you were referring to wokeness. Can be very dangerous when it's a matter of supporting people who claim that there is such a thing as blasphemy. It can be
Hmm.
deadly. So I would like to ask you. Oh gosh, I have so many more questions for you, but I know that we're a little bit limited on time. Maybe we'll have to do this again. For those of us who don't identify either with MAGA or that wing of the Republican Party or the liberal tendencies of wokeism, whether you want to call it the center, the pro-democracy coalition, whatever you want to call it, what what does this moment call for? What is our path forward?
Well, I think there's a few things. Right now, there is actually a kind of emergency where we just have to somehow figure out a way to return politics to a level of normalcy that is not there. I think, this Trump moment, the second term poses a serious threat. He's talking, and people around him are talking quite openly about a third term.
Yeah.
Like things that are unimaginable are now being talked about and are being normalized. It's extraordinarily dangerous. So the first order of business is simply to return to a kind of recognizable politics, and that means that you know people, I think, who are not invested in MAGA, people who you know can vote for Democrats, people like myself, um, we have to figure out how to have Democratic candidates that can win half of the country plus a little bit more. And right now, I don't see any Democratic candidates on the national horizon who are checking that box. So that's the emergency: is to have viable, plausible candidates that can speak beyond the kind of niche echo chamber of the kind of activist social justice politics that had captured the Democratic Party since the end of the Obama era, and really like achieved its apotheosis in the Biden administration. We have to have real politicians that real Americans can identify with. And when I say real Americans, I don't just mean the kind of mythical white working class. I mean, who are all these black men and Latinos who the Democratic Party hemorrhaged? We have to find people that can speak to them, who don't talk in ways that alienate them from what they think of as, their own interests, who don't talk in terms of moral clarity that don't make sense. So, for me, I can't see beyond that horizon really. It's like, how do we get politics back to normal? And once we could get there, it's within that space that we can kind of start to pursue other goals. But this is a kind of all hands on deck emergency to counter whatever this movement is trying to do with flirting with the idea of a guy that kind of makes himself president for life. And then you're no longer in a society that's recognizable to us.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I'm ambivalent about whether there are national candidates, Democratic candidates. Um, partly because I think there are candidates, national figures that can win a general. I think Pete Buttigieg can win a general. My bigger question though, is whether he can win a Democratic nomination.
Primary. Yeah.
Yeah, whether he can win the primary. Ruben Gallegos maybe doesn't have as big of a national profile as Mayor Pete, but he's someone who certainly speaks to the center in a lot of ways. Mikey some folks that are just now emerging at a higher level, Mikey Sherrill in Jersey, or Senator I just mentioned her in Michigan. So there are some figures, but again, the question, just like in the Republican Party, there are so many Republicans,
Oh,
like in
Whitmer, yeah.
Not Whitmer. She's a senator in
Oh,
Michigan. Um, now I feel like a doofus because I just mentioned her name. Senator in Michigan. She was in the Intel. She served Slotkin, Senator Slotkin. Um, but yeah, but again, just like there are any number of Republicans I could have envisioned voting for, in 16, probably 12 or 14 of them in 16,
hmm
but they would never make it past today's Republican primary. Okay, so as a way to start wrapping this up, let me ask you, we've sort of been talking about it already, but I'm going to ask you the TPNR question, talk of politics and religion question. What do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, perhaps even nurture relationships with people across our differences? So that's people who have different backgrounds and beliefs than we do. People maybe big brothers who you got in arguments when you were kids with. People who get their news from different sources than we do.
hmm
How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other, or is it even possible?
I mean, I'm sure you've heard this before, and you probably have also advocated for this. But I think the first thing to do is to talk to people face to face,
Yeah.
not as avatars on social media websites where people become kind of faceless, kind of targets for all of the opprobrium you want to heap on the viewpoints you disagree with. But people are actually flesh and blood human beings with families they care about and who sometimes are correct on things, sometimes are wrong, but generally mean well as you presume yourself to. Sitting down and talking to people in real community, not in this virtual space, I think would go a long way. I actually, I think that part of the reason our politics is so poisoned, I mean, it is no coincidence that this happens at the moment that, in the era that has become so dominated by social media and and by the idea that we all must talk to each other at all times and know each other's viewpoints and argue and debate politics, and that you can't kind of turn that off, that you have to both perform your values and police
Mm.
other people's values constantly in this kind of political and ethical panopticon of surveillance that social media is. I think nobody ever talks so disrespectfully to each other in person as people are willing to just like let loose on a stranger online. And so I think the best thing we can do to improve our political, disagreement, to have better faith arguments and more persuasive um, ways of disputing is to talk in real life in person, to go offline and to go into your churches or wherever you're present in your community, to have dinner with your family, to put the phone down, to actually talk and listen, not just talk to, not just lecture, but listen. That has to be, paramount in any way that we're going to learn from and persuade each other. Um, there are just things that people do now that are considered normal that are actually absurd, I want to be clear that what is happening on the MAGA right is worse. You have the worst kind of modeling of political disagreement and political messaging coming from the White House's official account now.
Yeah.
You see what they're putting out on Twitter. It's just unbelievable, and that's modeling for all of us as citizens how to disagree, and it's been toxic. Excuse me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I definitely agree with you. I have made certain rules with communicating online because in an ideal vacuum, it's a great way to stay connected with old friends, a great way to continue dialogue. So whenever possible, I do try to get into lengthy conversations only with people that I have a relationship with, or at least have the potential to have a relationship with. But sometimes you're writing for larger audiences, so inevitably you're coming in contact with people who you only see in black and white in print. In those instances, I guess what I found myself doing yesterday, it takes practice and I screw it up way more often than I get it right. But it takes a certain imagination to regardless of what they said, it just happened yesterday where somebody left a pretty vile comment in all caps, by the way. Um, I posted, so I'm a Christian, and I grew up very observantly Jewish, still identify as Jewish, but I'm also a Bible thumping Christian. So I posted a passage from a psalm, just quoted it with no commentary, and this dude, it's actually pretty. It's convicting of the words and actions and character of Donald Trump. Just word for word. So many pages of Bible you could do that with. So I kind of knew what I was doing, but I didn't make any commentary. I just quoted directly from Scripture, and this dude left the most vile comment. And so what I did in the past, I think he was just an easy target if I wanted to get into, like if I just wanted to bat him down. But what I did was I imagined his humanity, you know.
Hmm.
I imagined, and I could piece together a little couple of tidbits of information, who his daughter was, who I happened to graduate high school with. I saw him in a picture wearing a New York Giants shirt. I'm a Giants fan, So
Hmm.
um, it took some work and it takes some practice. But to imagine, as opposed to seeing him as an avatar for, you know,
Yeah.
all those maggots, as some
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
call him, I tried to imagine his humanity. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to hijack the answer to that question, but just kind of building upon you got me thinking. I'm building
Yeah, I
upon.
couldn't agree more with you. It's imagining humanity. That's exactly what the kind of digital interfaces strip us of being able to do. You go on Twitter, that's not a human being on the other end. That's just like a chance for you to rattle off like whatever critique you want to make, and then you move on. I mean, I think about like this couple that was outed at the Coldplay concert. It's not the same thing, but
Yeah,
it's really indicative of the kind of behaviors that are encouraged by the algorithm. It's just like you toss off one more just kind of like criticism of this couple and you just go about your business, but it actually accumulates on their end and it just destroys these people. And I think that's what we're all doing all the time to each other. And so then also we're censoring ourselves because we never want to actually say what we think and expose ourselves to that kind of vitriol. So people are really careful about what they say, and it just limits and narrows the discourse in ways that are, I think, pragmatically harmful. We have an epidemic of preference falsification where you every 4 years are surprised by who wins the election because no one tells you what they actually think.
yeah,
They keep it to themselves until they go in the voting booth and they say, how can Trump win? We didn't think that this many Latinos liked him, because no one's telling you what they actually think because no one wants to get piled on. It's just dangerous. It's not just wrong not to be able to talk to people as human beings. It's actually dangerous because you don't know what everybody around you actually thinks or wants or hopes for.
yeah,
It's an epistemic. It's an epistemic nightmare. Actually, you don't know enough about who you live around,
yeah.
who you share a community with.
It's a
Yeah.
really good point. I've heard you talk about that in other interviews and talk about it in a couple of your columns, where it's sort of this collateral damage, where in
Hmm.
some ways, unfortunately, the cancel culture movement or whatever you want to call it, has been successful in basically silencing,
Yeah.
this these exterior circles of people who don't even speak up. So we are surprised by results because we didn't
Yeah.
know this person is just tired of having people wag their fingers in his face. That a friend of mine is tired of having people wag their fingers in his face and say, "Your parents are from Puerto Rico. You should do this. You should." And he's like, "Stop
Right.
shooting on me," you know.
Right.
Okay, one of my last questions is, do you have any questions for me?
I do actually. Fascinated by your own personal trajectory. What is it like to change your mind as you did in such a fundamental way about your identity and your beliefs to go from thinking of yourself as a Jew to think of yourself as a Christian, but also having, I guess, a kind of secular cultural Jewish identity that carries through? What's it like to change your mind?
Oh, baby, that's a big question. um, I was having a hard time making sense of it, except in the early days, except that I was so compelled by what I thought of as the Devar Torah, the teaching of Jesus, what I was encountering, in Scripture, in New Testament Scripture. I was very familiar, obviously, with Hebrew Bible, Torah, all prophets' histories, etc. But I had never read New Testament. And then when I read Jesus's Devar Torah that starts in Matthew 5, which is known as the Sermon on the Mount, I was just absolutely gripped by it. The only thing that I had read before that was a book of James, which speaks directly to Jews. It starts with to the 12 tribes or whatever. It's like a direct address to Jews. So I felt like it was talking to me, and some of the things that it was grappling with, I was already grappling with, faith versus works and that sort of thing. But I was still, my head was spinning. And then I started reading a scholar named N.T. Wright, Tom Wright. And I began to understand, at least develop a vocabulary for understanding that there's this duality of a discontinuation and a continuation at the same time. Now, Wright is a historian, vocationally. He's also high up in the Anglican Church, but he was talking about historically what was happening, a continuation and a discontinuation. But I whenever somebody says I converted to Christianity, it always kind of takes me off guard. I feel like I didn't convert. I just kind of I started learning about Jesus and his claims to the messiahship, and started to see a coherence and a kind of a cogency and a profundity to the basic to the answers to some of the basic, most fundamental questions that he was providing. So to me, it was sort of a continuation, even though I knew full well it was a discontinuation. When you go back and you tell, in my case, I told my dad, who's now becoming, we were observant as kids. We went to an Orthodox synagogue, but later in his life, he's becoming even more observant. Wears a yarmulke, keeps kosher. So telling my dad that I was a Christian, very much a discontinuation. And that was the hardest part, was dealing with the possibility, especially at that age. I wasn't young. I was 29, I guess. But I was still young enough to where the approval of my father still really mattered.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So yeah, it's not an easy. Just I guess I'm still Jewish because it depends on the one hand, on the other hand. So that's my answer. On the one hand, on the other hand.
I love that. People who are able to question the kind of systems they were born into and reach conclusions through their own trial and error, and also their own learning and research. It's really a beautiful thing.
Oh, thanks, man. I really appreciate that. What a great question. Nobody asked me that specifically in that way, so I really appreciate that. Before we go, how can folks follow you, find more information about Summer of Our Discontent, and just all the great work that you're doing?
I'm on Twitter at Thomas Chatwill. I'm on Instagram at Chatterton Williams. Yeah, I'm present on those platforms. I write in The Atlantic. That's about it. You can buy the book anywhere books are sold, and I hope you read it and think about it, and I hope you even disagree with it, because I think, productive, good faith disagreement is actually how we arrive at better places.
Well, for what it's worth, I didn't quite get to the point where I was yelling at the book as I was reading it, but there were a couple points where I'm like, "What? What? I got stuff that I have to wrestle with a little bit more. Maybe next time I go to DC and hang out with Roush, he and I will argue about it."
Raise a glass for me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we covered a lot. Is there anything important I haven't asked you or we haven't discussed that you'd like to add before we call it a day?
No, I think that's great. Thank you for the thoughtful questions. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, and thanks for doing this. I know how much of a whirlwind, like I said, that these book tours can be. I'm just honored that you made some time for our program, and it's
It's a
great.
pleasure, Corey. Thanks.
Yeah, it's great to get to know you. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, remember to follow this show and write that review. Now you can watch these conversations on YouTube. It's youtube.com/@politicsandreligion. I am at Corey S. Nathan on all the socials, at COREY, S as in Sam, NATHAN. And I'll put the links so that you can find Thomas Chatterton Williams and the book. I'll put all the links in the show notes as well. Now, go talk some politics and religion, but with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.